You know that moment when someone doesn't just talk about a problem, they show you the proof? That's exactly what just happened in the NASCAR lawsuit, and it's not looking good for the defense. Day 8 of the trial just wrapped up in federal court, and it marked a major turning point. Michael Jordan's 23XI Racing and Front Row Motorsports finished presenting their entire case against NASCAR. After 8 days of building their argument, the plaintiffs rested, meaning they've shown all their evidence and called all their witnesses. Now NASCAR has to defend itself against everything that was just put on the record. The case centers on specific restrictions NASCAR puts on teams. First, there's the exclusivity clause that prevents teams from racing in other series. Second, there are supplier restrictions that control where teams can buy parts. Third, NASCAR maintains tight control over charter sales and transfers. And fourth, teams argue the revenue split from TV deals and sponsorships heavily favors NASCAR over the teams who actually race. Over the 8 days of testimony, the plaintiffs built their case piece by piece. They brought in witnesses and experts to show that NASCAR operates as a monopoly in top-level stock car racing. The argument is straightforward. If you want to race stock cars at the highest level in America, NASCAR is your only option. There's no real competitor. No alternative series. This gives NASCAR complete power over teams. Teams presented evidence about how the charter system works and why they believe it violates antitrust laws. Charters were introduced by NASCAR in 2016 to give teams stability and guaranteed spots in races. When they first came out, charters sold for around $2 to $6 million. Today, those same charters are worth somewhere between $25 and $40 million, possibly more. But here's the issue the teams raised. Even though charters have grown in value, NASCAR controls how and when teams can sell them. NASCAR has right of first refusal, meaning if a team wants to sell, NASCAR gets the first opportunity to buy. Teams argue this prevents them from getting full market value for their investment. The revenue distribution was another major focus of the plaintiff's case. Teams presented evidence showing they receive approximately 25% of NASCAR's television revenue. The plaintiffs compared this to other major sports leagues where teams typically receive closer to 50% of media rights money. This difference amounts to significant money that teams say they're missing out on. The parts and supplier restrictions also came under scrutiny during the trial. NASCAR requires teams to purchase certain parts from approved suppliers only. Teams cannot shop around for better prices or alternative vendors. The plaintiffs argued this costs them money and prevents normal market competition that would lower prices. Then there's the racing exclusivity issue. The charter agreement prohibits teams from participating in racing events sanctioned by other organizations. Teams say this prevents them from diversifying their business, generating additional revenue, and giving sponsors more exposure in other racing series. The plaintiffs also focused heavily on what happened in September 2024. That's when NASCAR presented teams with a final charter agreement and gave them a deadline to sign. According to testimony, NASCAR made it clear there would be no negotiations and no changes to the agreement. Teams had to take it or leave it. Most teams felt pressured to sign because refusing meant potentially losing their charter and everything they'd invested in their racing operations. 23XI Racing and Front Row Motorsports refused. Instead of signing what they considered an unfair and illegal agreement, they filed this lawsuit. The case also addressed release clauses in the charter agreements. These are provisions where teams agree not to sue NASCAR. The plaintiffs argued these releases were essentially forced on teams under threat of losing their ability to compete. Sign away your legal rights or lose your racing business. The teams contend this kind of coercion makes the releases invalid. Throughout the 8 days, the plaintiffs' legal team, led by attorney Jeffrey Kessler, methodically laid out their case. After 8 days of presenting evidence, building arguments, and calling witnesses, the plaintiffs rested their case on day 8. This was a significant moment because it meant NASCAR's defense team now had to respond to everything that had been presented, and that's when things got really interesting. NASCAR began its defense by calling Jim France to the witness stand. Jim France is known for staying out of the public eye. He rarely gives interviews. He doesn't do press conferences. Seeing him testify in open court was historic for NASCAR. It showed how seriously NASCAR is taking this case that they put their top executive on the stand. France's testimony was direct and unyielding. When asked about the charter system and the possibility of modifying the agreements, France made NASCAR's position crystal clear. He testified that NASCAR would not be negotiating changes to the charter agreements. The terms are set, and that's final. France defended NASCAR's control over the sport by explaining that the France family built NASCAR from nothing into what it is today. He argued that as the owners and operators of the sport, NASCAR has the right to set the terms for participation. Teams choose to be involved in NASCAR knowing what the rules are. On the revenue split question, France justified NASCAR's larger share by pointing to everything NASCAR does to run the sport. NASCAR negotiates the television deals, operates or sanctions the racetracks, promotes the events, and manages all the business operations. According to France, this justifies NASCAR keeping a larger portion of the revenue. France also addressed the supplier restrictions. He testified that these requirements exist for safety and quality control. NASCAR needs to ensure that parts meet certain standards and that competition remains fair. Allowing teams to buy from any supplier could create safety issues and competitive imbalances. The exclusivity clause, France explained, protects NASCAR's interests and prevents scheduling conflicts. If teams could race in other series whenever they wanted, it would create problems with NASCAR's schedule and potentially dilute the value of NASCAR events. When questioned about whether teams had input into the charter terms, France acknowledged that NASCAR ultimately made the final decisions about what went into the agreement. He maintained that this is appropriate because NASCAR owns and operates the series. France's testimony essentially confirmed what the plaintiffs had been arguing for 8 days. NASCAR does have complete control. NASCAR does make all the decisions. Teams do have to accept NASCAR's terms or leave. The difference is that France argued this is perfectly legal and appropriate, while the plaintiffs argue it's an illegal abuse of monopoly power. Legal observers watching the trial noted that France's firm stance might actually support the plaintiffs' case rather than help the defense. After 8 days of testimony about NASCAR's control over every aspect of team operations, having the NASCAR chairman admit that NASCAR alone makes all decisions and refuses to negotiate could reinforce the monopoly arguments. The defense case is now underway with more witnesses expected. NASCAR President Steve Phelps is anticipated to testify as the defense continues. NASCAR's legal team, led by attorney Christopher Yates, has to counter 8 days of plaintiff testimony and evidence. NASCAR's challenge is significant. They need to explain why their control over teams is legal and beneficial. They need to justify the revenue splits, the supplier restrictions, and the exclusivity clauses. They need to convince the judge that their system promotes competition rather than suppressing it. The trial also gained attention because of an unusual development involving a NASCAR sponsor. Richard Childress, owner of Richard Childress Racing, made public comments that appeared supportive of NASCAR's position. A major NASCAR sponsor then publicly criticized NASCAR President Steve Phelps and other NASCAR executives in response to Childress's comments. This was notable because sponsors typically avoid taking sides in disputes between sanctioning bodies and teams. The fact that a significant sponsor felt strongly enough to publicly call out NASCAR leadership suggests there may be broader concerns in the industry about how NASCAR manages its relationship with teams. The stakes in this case are enormous. If the judge rules in favor of 2311 Racing and Front Row Motorsports, NASCAR's entire business model could be forced to change. The charter system might need to be restructured.